Long before the United States became an independent nation, the eastern coast of North America was home to 13 British colonies. These colonies stretched from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Although they were ruled by Great Britain, each colony had its own local government, unique culture, and growing economy. Life in the colonies was challenging but full of opportunity. Farmers worked endless hours growing tobacco, rice, wheat, and corn. Merchants traded goods across the Atlantic Ocean. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and craftsmen built thriving communities. Families lived simple lives, relying on hard work and strong faith to survive. The colonies continued to grow rapidly. By the middle of the 18th century, more than 2 million people lived there. Cities such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston became important centers of trade and commerce. However, beneath this prosperity, tensions were beginning to rise. In 1754, Britain and France entered a major conflict in North America known as the French and Indian War. After years of fighting, Britain emerged victorious. Although Britain had gained vast new territories, the war had left the British government deeply in debt. To recover the enormous cost of the war, the British Parliament decided that the American colonies should help pay the expenses. New taxes were introduced on paper, newspapers, legal documents, tea, glass, paint, and many other everyday goods. Many colonists were furious. They believed that they should not be taxed by a government in London where they had no elected representatives. Their famous protest was captured in a powerful slogan, "No taxation without representation." The slogan quickly spread throughout the colonies. Public meetings were held in town squares. Newspapers criticized British policies. Merchants organized boycotts against British products, refusing to import goods from England. Ordinary people who had once considered themselves loyal British subjects now began asking difficult questions. Who had the right to govern them? Should a king living thousands of miles away control every aspect of their lives? Or should the colonies govern themselves? These questions marked the beginning of one of the most important political movements in world history. At first, very few people wanted complete independence. Most colonists simply hoped that the British government would change its policies and respect their rights. But every new law created more anger. Every new tax increased resistance. Every protest brought greater conflict. No one realized that these disagreements would soon ignite a revolution that would forever change the world. This was only the beginning. In the next chapter, growing protests in Boston would push Britain and the colonies closer to open conflict, leading to one of the most famous acts of rebellion in history, the Boston Tea Party. By the late 1760s, the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies had become increasingly tense. British soldiers were stationed in Boston to enforce new laws and maintain order. To many colonists, however, the presence of armed troops in their streets felt more like an occupation than protection. Every day, arguments broke out between soldiers and civilians. Merchants complained about unfair taxes. Dock workers protested British trade restrictions. Newspapers published articles criticizing the Crown, and public anger continued to grow. On the evening of March 5, 1770, everything changed. A crowd of colonists gathered on King Street in Boston. They shouted at a small group of British soldiers, throwing snowballs, ice, and pieces of wood. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Suddenly, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. The tragic event became known as the Boston Massacre. Although the exact events of that night remain debated by historians, colonial leaders used the incident to rally public opinion against British rule. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches described the victims as martyrs for liberty. Across the colonies, anger toward Britain intensified. For a short time, tensions eased. Some unpopular taxes were repealed, but one tax remained, the tax on tea. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company special privileges to sell tea in the colonies. While the tea itself became cheaper, many colonists believed the law was another attempt to force them to accept taxation without representation. Resistance spread quickly. On the cold night of December 16, 1773, a group known as the Sons of Liberty carried out one of the most famous protests in American history. Disguised as Mohawk warriors, they quietly boarded 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Working through the night, they opened more than 340 chests of tea and dumped them into the icy water below. The harbor became covered with floating tea leaves. Not a single chest was stolen. Nothing else on the ships was damaged. Their message was clear. The American colonies would no longer accept laws imposed without their consent. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. When news reached London, the British government was furious. King George III and Parliament believed the colonies had openly defied the authority of the British Empire. In response, Britain passed a series of harsh laws known as the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed, trade was halted, local self-government was restricted. British military power in the colonies was expanded. Instead of intimidating the colonists, these measures united them. People from different colonies sent food and supplies to Boston. Leaders began communicating more closely than ever before. For the first time, many Americans realized they were fighting not just as separate colonies, but as one people with a shared cause. The conflict had moved beyond taxes. It had become a struggle over freedom, rights, and self-government. The road to revolution was now impossible to stop. In the next chapter, colonial leaders would gather to form the First Continental Congress, and the first shots of the American Revolutionary War would soon echo across the countryside. The events of the Boston Tea Party changed everything. Instead of weakening the colonies, Britain's harsh response only strengthened their determination. Across America, people realized that if one colony could be punished so severely, none of them were truly safe. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for an important meeting that would become known as the First Continental Congress. The delegates came from different backgrounds. Some were lawyers, others were merchants, farmers, or political leaders. While they did not all agree on every issue, they shared one common goal: to protect the rights and freedoms of the colonies. The Congress agreed to boycott British goods and demanded that the British government repeal the intolerable acts. At this point, most delegates still hoped that peace could be restored. Independence was not yet their primary objective. Meanwhile, Britain believed the growing resistance had become a serious threat. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, received orders to stop the colonial rebellion before it spread further. British intelligence reported that colonial militias were secretly collecting weapons and ammunition in the town of Concord. On the night of April 18, 1775, around 700 British soldiers quietly marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission was simple: seize the colonial weapons, arrest key Patriot leaders if possible, and crush the rebellion before it could begin. But the colonists had their own network of spies and messengers. As soon as the British troops began their march, riders hurried across the countryside warning nearby towns. The most famous of these messengers was Paul Revere, whose midnight ride became one of the legendary moments in American history. As church bells rang and alarm drums echoed through the villages, local militias prepared for battle. Before sunrise on April 19, 1775, British soldiers arrived in the small village of Lexington. There, they found about 70 colonial militia members standing quietly on the village green. Neither side wanted to fire first. The tension was overwhelming. Then, without warning, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, no one knows who fired that first shot. Within seconds, both sides opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 8 American militiamen were dead. The British continued their march toward Concord, but by the time they reached the town, most of the colonial weapons had already been hidden. At the North Bridge in Concord, colonial militia units fought back. For the first time, American forces successfully forced British soldiers to retreat. The long march back to Boston became a nightmare for the British Army. Thousands of colonial militia members fired from behind trees, stone walls, barns, and houses. Instead of fighting in open fields, they used the landscape to their advantage. The British column suffered heavy casualties throughout the day. By nightfall, hundreds of soldiers had been killed or wounded. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. The conflict that many had hoped to avoid had finally begun. News of the fighting spread rapidly across the colonies. Farmers left their fields. Blacksmiths put down their tools. Merchants closed their shops. Thousands of ordinary men volunteered to defend their homes and their liberties. Within weeks, nearly 20,000 colonial militia surrounded Boston, trapping British forces inside the city. What had started as protests over taxes had now become a full-scale war. The struggle for American independence had officially begun. In the next chapter, a respected Virginia planter named George Washington would be chosen to lead the Continental Army, facing one of the greatest military powers in the world. The battles at Lexington and Concord had changed the course of history. What had begun as scattered protests against British rule had now become an armed rebellion. Across the colonies, thousands of volunteers rushed to join local militias. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths left their workshops, and merchants closed their stores to fight for a cause they believed in. But there was one major problem. The colonial forces had courage, but they lacked organization. Each colony had its own militia, its own officers, and its own way of fighting. There was no single army, no unified command, and no clear military strategy. The leaders meeting in Philadelphia knew that if they hoped to defeat the powerful British Empire, they needed a professional commander. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress made a historic decision. They unanimously appointed George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was 43 years old. He stood over 6 feet 2 inches tall, making him an impressive figure for his time. Calm, disciplined, and respected throughout the colonies, he had previously served as an officer during the French and Indian War. Although he had military experience, Washington fully understood the enormous challenge before him. Britain possessed one of the strongest armies and the most powerful navy in the world. Its soldiers were highly trained, well-equipped, and supported by vast financial resources. The Continental Army, on the other hand, faced constant shortages. Many soldiers lacked proper uniforms. Some had no shoes. Others carried old hunting rifles instead of military muskets. Food, ammunition, medicine, and supplies were often scarce. Despite these hardships, Washington refused to give up. When he arrived outside Boston in July 1775, he found thousands of determined volunteers surrounding the city, where British forces remained trapped. Washington immediately began transforming the scattered militias into a disciplined fighting force. He introduced regular military drills. He established a clear chain of command. He improved camp organization and encouraged strict discipline among his troops. He believed that courage alone could not win a war. Training, patience, and unity would be just as important. As the months passed, the Continental Army slowly became more organized. Meanwhile, another dramatic event unfolded. Far to the north, American forces captured Fort Ticonderoga, securing dozens of heavy cannons. A brilliant young officer named Henry Knox volunteered for an almost impossible mission. During the freezing winter, Knox transported the massive cannons hundreds of miles across snow-covered mountains, frozen rivers, and dangerous wilderness using oxen and sleds. Many believed the journey could not be completed. Yet, against all odds, Knox succeeded. In early 1776, the cannons arrived outside Boston. Washington secretly placed them on the high ground overlooking the city. When British commanders awoke and saw the powerful artillery aimed directly at their ships in defensive positions, they realized they faced a terrible choice. Fight a costly battle, or abandon the city. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston. Thousands of soldiers and loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed away. For the first time since the fighting had begun, the Continental Army had achieved a major victory. The success electrified the colonies. People celebrated in the streets. Church bells rang. Hope spread across America. Yet Washington knew the war was far from over. The British Empire had not been defeated. It was simply preparing for an even larger campaign. Soon, thousands of British troops and warships would arrive in New York, setting the stage for one of the greatest military confrontations of the Revolutionary War. The fight for American independence had only just begun. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies stood at a turning point. War had already begun. Armies were being formed and battles had been fought. But there was still one question that divided many colonists. Were they fighting only for their rights within the British Empire or for complete independence? Inside the city of Philadelphia, leaders gathered once again for the Second Continental Congress. The atmosphere was tense because the decision they were about to make would determine the future of an entire continent. Many delegates still feared breaking completely from Britain. They knew that declaring independence meant war with one of the most powerful empires in the world. But others believed that peace with Britain was no longer possible. Among the strongest voices for independence was Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian lawyer. He was chosen to write a document that would explain to the world why the colonies were separating from Britain. After days of intense writing and revision, the final draft was presented. On July 4, 1776, the Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document stated that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It declared that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states. When the news spread, bells rang across cities and towns. People celebrated in the streets, but many also understood that the decision had made peace with Britain impossible. The war was now a fight for survival. At the same time, a massive British military force was preparing its next move. Thousands of British troops, supported by a powerful navy, sailed toward New York City, a key strategic location. Their goal was clear: to crush the rebellion and capture Washington's army. George Washington knew the danger immediately. He rushed his Continental Army to defend New York, but the situation was grim. The British forces were larger, better trained, and better equipped. In August 1776, the British launched a massive attack. The Battle of Long Island became one of the largest battles of the entire war. American forces fought bravely, but they were outmatched. Washington faced a painful reality. His army risked being destroyed. Under the cover of night, he made a bold and risky decision. He secretly evacuated thousands of soldiers across the East River. Using small boats in perfect timing, the entire Continental Army escaped capture. When the British advanced, they found the American positions empty. Although it was not a victory, Washington's escape saved the revolution itself. If the army had been captured, the war might have ended right there. Instead, the Continental Army lived to fight another day. But the situation remained desperate. Washington's forces continued to retreat across New Jersey, chased by British troops. Morale was low. Many soldiers deserted. The future of American independence looked uncertain. Yet, even in the darkest moments, the idea of a free nation continued to survive. In the next chapter, the war would take a dramatic and unexpected turn as Washington prepared a daring counterattack that would change everything. By the winter of 1776, the American cause was in serious danger. After the defeats in New York, George Washington and his Continental Army were forced to retreat across New Jersey. British forces, confident of victory, pursued them closely, believing the rebellion was close to collapse. The Continental Army was in terrible condition. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and poorly clothed. Many had lost faith in the war. Some enlistments were about to expire, and desertions were increasing every day. The dream of independence seemed to be fading. But George Washington refused to give up. He understood that if something was not done quickly, the entire revolution could be lost. On the night of December 25, 1776, Washington made one of the most daring decisions in military history. Despite freezing temperatures, snow, and dangerous ice on the Delaware River, he planned a surprise attack on a British garrison in Trenton, New Jersey. Most of his officers believed the mission was too risky. The river was filled with ice chunks. The weather was brutal. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. But Washington insisted. That night, in complete darkness, his army began crossing the Delaware River. Boats struggled against the icy current. Wind howled across the water. Soldiers shivered in the freezing cold. Some weapons became wet and unusable. Despite all this, Washington's army crossed successfully. At dawn on December 26, 1776, the Continental Army launched a surprise attack on the Hessian forces stationed in Trenton. The Hessians were German mercenaries fighting for the British. They were not expecting an attack in such harsh weather. The battle was swift and decisive. American forces overwhelmed the enemy, capturing hundreds of soldiers and supplies with minimal losses. The victory at Trenton sent shockwaves through the colonies. For the first time in many months, hope returned. But Washington knew one victory was not enough. Just days later, British reinforcements moved in to retaliate. Instead of retreating, Washington made another bold move. On January 3, 1777, he secretly marched his army around the British forces and attacked them at Princeton, New Jersey. The battle was fierce and chaotic. American troops fought with determination, surprising the British once again. When the fighting ended, Washington had achieved another important victory. These two battles, Trenton and Princeton, changed the course of the war. They proved that the Continental Army could defeat professional British troops. They restored confidence among American soldiers and civilians, and they strengthened Washington's reputation as a brilliant and fearless leader. After these victories, many soldiers re-enlisted, and new recruits joined the cause. The revolution, which had seemed close to collapse only weeks earlier, was now alive again. But the war was far from over. The British were preparing new strategies, and larger battles were still ahead. In the next chapter, the conflict would expand into a global war, and foreign powers would begin to influence the fight for American independence. After the victories at Trenton and Princeton, the American Revolution was far from over. The war continued to rage across the colonies, with both sides preparing for larger and more decisive battles. The British believed that if they could split the colonies in two, the rebellion would collapse. Their strategy focused on controlling the Hudson River Valley, a vital route that connected New England with the southern colonies. To achieve this, British General John Burgoyne led a large army south from Canada in 1777. His goal was to meet other British forces advancing from different directions and isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. At first, the plan seemed powerful and well-organized. The British Army was confident, well-supplied, and supported by experienced officers. But the American forces were also adapting. Under the leadership of General Horatio Gates and other commanders, colonial troops used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, surprise attacks, and constant harassment of British supply lines. The dense forests, rough terrain, and long supply routes made it extremely difficult for the British Army to advance. As weeks passed, Burgoyne's forces became increasingly trapped. Supplies ran low. Reinforcements failed to arrive. The American resistance grew stronger. By September 1777, the British Army found itself surrounded near Saratoga, New York. Two major battles took place: the Battle of Freeman's Farm and the Battle of Bemis Heights. Both sides fought fiercely, but the Americans slowly gained the upper hand. British casualties increased, while their position became more desperate. Finally, in October 1777, General Burgoyne faced a harsh reality. His army could not continue fighting or escape. On October 17, 1777, he made the difficult decision to surrender his entire force to the Americans. This moment became one of the most important turning points in the war. The American victory at Saratoga shocked the world. For the first time, the Continental Army had defeated a major British army in a large, conventional battle. But the impact went beyond the battlefield. News of the victory reached Europe quickly. France, which had been secretly watching the conflict, now saw a real chance that Britain could be weakened. Soon after Saratoga, France officially entered the war on the side of the American colonies. French military support, money, weapons, and naval power dramatically changed the balance of the conflict. What had once been a local rebellion was now becoming an international war. British forces were now forced to fight not only American soldiers, but also powerful European armies and navies. The revolution had gained a powerful ally, but victory was still not guaranteed. The war would continue for several more years, testing the endurance of soldiers, leaders, and civilians across the colonies. In the next chapter, the struggle would reach its most difficult period as the Continental Army faced hardship, suffering, and survival at Valley Forge. After the victory at Saratoga and the entry of France into the war, the American Revolution gained new hope. But despite these developments, the winter of 1777 brought one of the darkest chapters in the struggle for independence. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, marched into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There was no enemy attack at Valley Forge. Instead, the enemy was cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The winter was brutally harsh. Snow covered the ground for miles. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers lived in makeshift wooden huts built with logs and mud. Many had no proper shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Clothing was torn and insufficient to protect against the cold. Food supplies were dangerously low. Soldiers often survived on small rations of bread and weak broth. Disease spread quickly through the camp, including typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia. Thousands of soldiers suffered. Many died. Others deserted. The Continental Army was in danger of collapsing from within. Yet George Washington refused to abandon his men. He remained in the camp with them, sharing their hardships and encouraging discipline and unity. His presence became a symbol of resilience. During this difficult winter, a key transformation took place. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived to assist the American cause. He was an experienced soldier who had served in European armies. Von Steuben began training the Continental Army in modern military discipline. He taught soldiers how to march in formation, use coordinated maneuvers, and improve battlefield communication. Because many soldiers spoke different languages or had no formal training, he used simple instructions and practical demonstrations. Step by step, the Continental Army became more organized and effective. By spring 1778, the transformation was visible. What had once been a struggling group of volunteers was now becoming a professional fighting force. In June 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia, and Washington's strengthened army pursued them across New Jersey. At the Battle of Monmouth, the Continental Army fought the British to a standstill, proving its improved strength and discipline. Valley Forge became a symbol of endurance. It showed that the American Revolution was not only fought on battlefields, but also through suffering, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. The army had survived its darkest winter, and it had emerged stronger than before. But the war was still far from over. In the next chapter, the conflict would shift toward the southern colonies, where the final and most decisive phase of the American Revolution would begin. After the hardships of Valley Forge and the growing strength of the Continental Army, the war entered a new and decisive phase. The British changed their strategy, shifting their focus to the southern colonies, where they believed they could gather stronger loyalist support and regain control of the war. In 1778 and 1779, British forces began capturing key cities in the South, including Savannah and Charleston. Their plan was simple: divide and conquer. By gaining control of the southern region, they hoped to crush the American resistance from within. At first, the strategy seemed successful. British commanders won several battles and occupied important territories. However, controlling the countryside proved far more difficult than controlling cities. In the rural South, American militia groups, often led by commanders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla warfare tactics. They struck quickly, disappeared into forests and swamps, and constantly disrupted British supply lines. The British Army, although powerful in open battle, struggled against this unpredictable style of fighting. As the war dragged on, both sides became exhausted. Supplies were limited, morale fluctuated, and the conflict became increasingly brutal. In 1780, the British focused their efforts on the Carolinas. Major battles took place at Camden and Guilford Courthouse. Although the British claimed tactical victories, they suffered heavy losses that weakened their overall position. Meanwhile, American leadership adapted. General Nathanael Greene took command in the South and began a strategy of strategic retreat, avoiding full-scale battles while slowly wearing down British forces. This approach proved highly effective. By 1781, the British Army under General Cornwallis moved north into Virginia, seeking a decisive victory that would end the war. Cornwallis eventually established a strong defensive position at Yorktown, Virginia, believing he could be supplied and reinforced by the British Navy. But the situation was about to change dramatically. Unknown to the British, a powerful French fleet was sailing toward the American coast. French naval forces, led by Admiral de Grasse, prepared to block British escape routes by sea. At the same time, George Washington saw a rare opportunity. For the first time, he could coordinate a combined American and French operation to trap a major British army. Washington moved his forces rapidly from New York to Virginia in a secret and carefully planned march. French troops under General Rochambeau joined him. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The war that had begun with protests, taxes, and distant political arguments was now about to reach its decisive end. All roads led to Yorktown. In the next and final chapter, the fate of a nation would be decided on the battlefield. By the fall of 1781, the American Revolution had reached its final and most decisive stage. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and shifting fortunes, the fate of the war now depended on a single location: Yorktown, Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis had positioned his army in Yorktown, believing the location was secure. He expected reinforcements and supply support from the British Navy, confident that he could hold out against American pressure. But he was mistaken. A powerful French fleet arrived on the Atlantic coast, led by Admiral de Grasse. The fleet successfully blocked British ships from entering Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea. At the same time, George Washington moved with extraordinary speed and precision. His Continental Army, joined by French forces under General Rochambeau, marched hundreds of miles from New York to Virginia in a secret operation. For the first time in the war, American and French forces worked together in full coordination. By late September 1781, Yorktown was completely surrounded. British forces were trapped, landed by the combined American and French armies on one side, and blocked by the French Navy on the other. Inside the city, conditions quickly worsened. Supplies ran low. Soldiers became exhausted. Hope of rescue faded. Day after day, American and French artillery bombarded British defenses. The ground shook with constant explosions. Fortifications were destroyed piece by piece. Cornwallis realized the truth. There was no escape. On October 19, 1781, he made the final decision to surrender his entire army. British drums played the traditional tune of surrender as thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons. The war was effectively over. The surrender at Yorktown marked the end of major fighting in the American Revolution. Although peace negotiations continued for some time, Britain had lost its ability to continue the war effectively. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the independence of the United States of America. After years of conflict, the 13 colonies had become a new nation. George Washington would later resign his military command and return to civilian life, becoming a symbol of leadership and restraint. The ideas that fueled the revolution, liberty, representation, and self-government, spread across the world, influencing future revolutions and democratic movements. The American Revolution was not only a war, it was the birth of a nation built on the belief that people could govern themselves, and it began with a question that changed the world forever.